Finally, this is going to be my last review for a movie released in 2015 before I come out with my best and worst lists of that year. I will still review a lot of movies that I wasn't able to review last year after those videos, but let's just get this one over with. Apologies if I don't really have my voice, I kind of lost it yesterday, so just bear with me, hopefully. So Frankenstein vs. the Mummy is written and directed by Damien Leone and stars Max Reiser, Ashton Lee, Brandon Despain, and Constantine Tripes. And believe it or not, Frankenstein vs. the Mummy isn't actually about Frankenstein's monster fighting a mummy. It's about college professor Victor Frankenstein, played by Max Reiser, trying to reanimate a body, and another college professor, Naihla Khalil, played by Ashton Lee, dealing with a cursed mummy she brought back from Egypt. Then there's a bunch of talking for about 2 hours, yeah. Number one, yes, this movie actually came out in Philippine cinemas in 2015, so I am reviewing it. And I guess I'm making it my own personal mission to review every Frankenstein movie that comes out, because I don't think anyone ever makes good Frankenstein movies. And just like Token and Taken 3, this movie is also really, really bad. It just pretty much nothing happens in this movie till the last 10 minutes. The direction is just lifeless, and there's so much dialogue in this movie, but no one's actually saying anything, if you know what I mean. And you can tell right off the bat that this movie is yet another straight-to-DVD release with no budget behind it because of how limited the production design is. Pretty much most of this movie takes place in only 2 areas. One area for the Frankenstein stuff to happen, and one area for the mummy stuff to happen. And in these sets, there's this painful lack of set decoration that might have otherwise helped ground the film's setting, or at least add personality to the story. I will say though that the sound mixing in the movie is surprisingly quite clean, and the sound editing is pretty effective for, you know, when people's organs get ripped from their bodies. But, you know, the score in this movie, unfortunately, is really annoying because it just, again, it's just very standard thriller sounds and whatnot, and it just doesn't really work. It tries to underscore certain scenes too heavily, so they come off as, again, unintentionally funny. But the thing is, I firmly believe that a small budget doesn't always equal, you know, a bad movie, like right off the bat, because lots of movies in cinematic history have proven that a small budget doesn't necessarily hinder creativity. I think the Blair Witch Project is the best example of this. What they were able to do with just atmosphere is really, really impressive. But that is exactly this movie's problem. It doesn't have a budget, but it also doesn't really have creativity. Like, with a premise like this, you'd think it would be relatively easy to set things up quickly and have some cheesy monster fun for like 2 hours. But what this movie does, it keeps its titular characters apart until the very last 10 minutes, and the fight they have literally is only about 2 minutes long. So for pretty much the entire movie, the film feels roughly divided into 2 completely separate parts, you know, one for all the Frankenstein stuff, one for all the mummy stuff, then just kind of intertwines at the end. And it's not, these 2 separate arcs aren't even really related thematically speaking, so as a result, it's just kind of slow and boring the entire time. But what really surprised me about this movie is that it's a shockingly worthy movie, especially for a straight-to-DVD film. At first, the dialogue comes off as intelligent because they are talking in depth about certain philosophical ideas and whatnot, but after the first 5 minutes, it starts to feel like you're scrolling through notes for some class that you don't really care about. So there's really no real exploration of these themes. It feels like they're using all this dialogue just to kind of set up a backdrop that they never actually refer to. And what's disappointing is that the characters aren't reflective of their beliefs. You know, you don't really get a sense that Victor Frankenstein really believes in all these things he's talking about. And Frankenstein vs. Mummy doesn't really have a plot at all. In fact, the entire movie is this setup for this 2-minute fight that happens at the end, and all this setup could have been condensed to easily like 20 minutes. And in terms of acting, Max Reiser is just going through the motions and doesn't actually anchor his portrayal of Victor Frankenstein on anything really, because he's a romantic leading man in like one scene, and then in the next scene he's this unhinged mad scientist, so it's really, really inconsistent. And Ashton Lee, who plays Naihla, just never comes across as a professor. I guess that's also the fault of casting, but again, she just doesn't do anything to make me believe that she is this intellectual woman who's interested in mummies in Egypt and stuff. And I have a sneaking suspicion that her usual roles in movies consist of being like an expendable teenager who dies in a horror movie. I will say though that the actors who play the monsters have decent enough physicality to them in their performances, but Brandon Despain, who plays the mummy, just isn't really given anything else to do other than grunt and walk around. And Constantine Tripes, who plays Frankenstein's monster, he starts out being pretty interesting, and then the direction they go with Frankenstein's monster, turning him into some sort of rapist, is kind of weird. And I feel like the director here, Damien Leone, was definitely more invested in the relatively heady script he was writing than in how he was going to interpret the script to the screen, because the direction is mostly very static all throughout. Camera placements are exactly the same, blocking is exactly the same, and the one action scene that happens at the end is a little more than just the two monsters kind of grabbing each other's shoulders and pushing each other around. This is actually one occasion where I think that jump scares would be welcome, because at certain times you forget that this is a horror movie at all. It's supposed to be a horror movie at least. This movie has but one good thing going for it, and I will say that for what this movie is, the mummy costume and the Frankenstein's monster makeup are surprisingly pretty impressive and believable, as are the gore effects that are genuinely gross to see. It almost feels like this entire movie was built around the fact that they had budget for makeup effects and whatnot, and for that I will give it credit. So in the end, while this movie is not as bad as Taken or Taken 3, it's still a really bad movie. What's disappointing is that I do see potential here. There is potential not just with the visual effects and stuff, but I feel like if Damien Leone could have been given like a bigger canvas and a bit more time to develop these ideas, he might actually be capable of doing good stuff in the future. Alright, so those are my thoughts on Frankenstein versus the Mummy. Have you guys seen it? What do you think about it? Whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.